Okay, I make it exactly 6 o'clock, and I know we have a lot of very rich and fascinating material to cover in this session together. So I think we will start, and I'll let people in as necessary. Very good. Well, I think many of you will know by now, I'm the founding director of a project called Insiders Outsiders. It's an ongoing program of now mostly online events, paying tribute, but also scrutinizing, analyzing, delving deeper into the stories of the former refugees, I should say, from Nazi Europe, who contributed so hugely to primarily British culture. But as we'll see in the case of Ella Briggs, many of them had checkered journeys, to say the very least, and London may have been only one stop on their, on in their life story. I'm going to hand over, because this is essentially an architecture session, I'm going to hand over very shortly to my friend and colleague Valeria Carullo to be in charge of today's event. But I'd just like to say a very brief introduction, if I may, to her. As many of you will know, she's the photography curator or photographs curator at the Royal Institute of British Architects here in London, where I'm based, she's based, and Barbara is based. But of course, one of the wonders of technology. It's not the same as being in the room together, but we have Elana in Vienna, we have Despina in America. How wonderful is that? It's very much an international team tonight, in keeping with the nature of the story that we're going to be hearing about. But to go back to Valeria, so she's in charge of the photography collection at the RIBA, but she's also, and I think most pertinently, and some of you may not yet know this, she is the founding director of a truly wonderful project, which is delving into the RIBA Refugee Committee, the Refugee Architects Committee, that did so much when possible, not always possible, to help refugee, mostly architects, but sometimes artists and others besides, to find sanctuary in the UK. And it's an ongoing project. I'm full of admiration for what Valeria has done. And in fact, tomorrow, for those of you who are in London and interested, there's going to be an event at the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'll mention it now, so I don't forget later. Tomorrow at, what time is it, Valeria? Is it 6 o'clock, 6:30? You're muted? Just, yeah.
Sorry about that. It's 6:30, yes.
6:30 in Bloomsbury, which actually is a launch event for the database, which, is what I'm talking about here. It's yeah, absolutely fascinating project, and well worth knowing about. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Valeria. I shall absent myself in a minute to host the event and to introduce our three speakers, the contributors to this wonderful new publication. Valeria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's an honor, really. It's a pleasure to chair this event. It's a topic that's of huge interest to me. Obviously, she was a female architect. She was an émigré architect, so very much like in the part of, really part of the research that I've been conducting in the last few years. I find it quite extraordinary that she's not better known, but perhaps not surprising. She was obviously I think, a real pioneer in a male-dominated profession. She was the first female architect to become a member of the Austrian Association of Engineers and Architects. Really at a time where there were so few of them. Here in Britain, we had a handful, like people like Elizabeth Scott, Sadie Spade, Elizabeth Benjamin, Mary Mead, and very few others. And also what I find really fascinating is that she seemed to have lived many lives, not just one, and very rich lives. She worked and studied and worked both in Austria and in Germany. She photographed in Italy, she crossed continents. So I don't want to give too much away about this incredible story, but you probably all know that she eventually settled here in Britain. So the authors of the amazing book that's going to be presented tonight, Despina Stratigakos, Elana Shapira, and Barbara Penner is a contributor to the book as well. So Despina is a SUNY Distinguished Professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Buffalo, State University of New York. And her books include Where Are the Women Architects and A Women's Berlin. Elana Shapira is lecturer in the Cultural Studies Department at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. She's the author of books Style and Seduction, and also the editor of various books such as Design Dialogue, Designing Transformation, and also Gestalterinnen. And finally, Barbara Penner is professor in the Architectural Humanities at the Butler School of Architecture at UCL. here in London, and her contribution to the present book is the chapter London, Struggles, New Beginnings, and a Commission. I then leave the floor to Despina, who will begin with her presentation.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. And I am excited to be joining you from sunny Buffalo. I will present a very brief overview of Ella Briggs's life and work, and then talk about our novel methods for writing the biography. So let's begin with our subject. Born into a Jewish family in Vienna in 1880, Briggs studied at Vienna's Kunstgewerbeschule, or School of Applied Arts, under some of the leading secessionist artists of the day. In 1903, she relocated to New York, where she worked in the graphic arts for the following 2 years. And this makes her, as far as we know, the first ever secessionist-trained artist to practice in New York. Thus begun Briggs's love affair with the city, which would see her return to live and work there several more times over the next 2 decades. By 1908, Briggs's practice had shifted to interior and furniture design. Her work blended secession and Glasgow-style influences with local traditions, such as the arts and crafts styles emerging in New York State. Yet her style is also hard to pin down because she absorbed and transformed the artistic currents she encountered through relocation. And if anything, her style is about that blending and contextualization. Prominent projects in New York, including the interiors of the New German Theater, which opened in 1908, made her a sought-after designer in New York, lauded for bringing the latest modern trends from Vienna. Despite this acclaim, she soon moved back to Vienna, where she opened her own interior design firm, and here you see a project from that era. World War I brought an end to Briggs's firm, propelling her in a new professional direction. In 1917, she was instrumental in integrating architecture studies at the Technical University of Vienna and later Munich, from which she graduated in 1920. Over the next 4 decades, she pursued artistic projects in 5 countries: Austria, the United States, Italy, Germany, and England. She also wrote extensively about the modern house for popular and professional journals, took up architectural photography, and became an influential exhibition designer. Her built projects focused on housing both small and large scale. Her designs centered the user's needs and aimed above all to lessen the housewife's burden through labor-saving plans and technologies. Although innovative in her approach to the modern house and client, she did not adhere strictly to the canonical modernist style. Modernity for Briggs was not about aesthetics, but rather about how one lived in the home. Briggs's frequent migrations across oceans and national borders was not unusual for women in architecture who often had to move to secure work. Briggs thrived through migration, which brought her into contact with new people and ideas and transformed her into a conduit for the transnational flow of modernistic concepts. As noted earlier, she loved to blend influences from different places to suit each client, an approach explored not only in her designs, but also in her writings. Only one of her relocations, it seems, was involuntary, and it was also her last. Persecuted under the Hitler regime, she fled to London in 1936, where she remained for the rest of her life, and she died in 1977. I sketch out this brief biography to emphasize that Briggs's life and work, as well as her impact as a designer and architect, cannot be divorced from migration. Her peripatetic lifestyle profoundly shaped her work and put her at the center of modernist hotspots, where she became a significant contributor to architectural discourses, in part because of her ability to synthesize and adapt broader trends. Yet this very movement and fluidity have also made it extremely difficult to write about her. And here I turn to issues of methodology and institutions and what it took for us to write this biography. I initially encountered Ella Briggs as a doctoral student in the 1990s, researching the first women in Germany to study and practice architecture. Briggs stood out as an exceptional figure within the modernist movement, yet the picture I could compose of her was deeply fragmented due to her pattern of living and working in almost constant migration. My research budget and time frame were limited, so I focused on certain locations where she had been active and incorporated that material into my dissertation. But many questions remained, and they continue to niggle at the back of my mind for 25 years. From time to time, a determined scholar would reach out to me about their own research on Ella Briggs, asking for help with sources. I was happy to provide what I had, but inevitably, these scholars encountered the same problems that I had faced. While it was possible to flesh out local projects, without a grasp of the larger transnational aspects of Briggs's life and work, our understanding remained woefully incomplete. We had pieces of a puzzle, but not a complete picture. At its core, the problem was not just about research budgets and timeframes. Briggs immersed herself in the places where she lived and worked, meeting artists, finding clients, and making friends. To be able to understand these people and places and how they had influenced her, and in turn, how she had influenced them, required knowledge of the specific cultural, social, political, and economic context in which Briggs operated. Gilded Age New York is not Red Vienna, for example, nor is it Nazi Germany or post-war England. For a single historian working alone, the challenges to researching and writing Briggs's biography proved, time and again, to be insurmountable. Then came a breakthrough. In 2019, Elana Shapira, who is co-presenting tonight, contacted me about her interest in Ella Briggs. She became aware of Briggs because of the centenary celebrations of Red Vienna, which brought new attention to this female architect, one of only two, along with Greta Szydlahowski, who had worked on the municipal social housing projects. During a subsequent call, we discussed the research hurdles that Briggs's life posed and fell into a shared moment of reverie. Wouldn't it be great if we could bring all the scholars who had worked on Briggs together in one room to see if we could finally piece together her story? Dr. Shapira was determined to make this happen, and on a warm day in June 2022, we convened a workshop on Briggs at the Architekturzentrum Wien, Austria's National Architecture Museum. By the end of the day, we had the beginnings of a new collaborative strategy that would help us to finally break the decades-long impasse that had prevented Briggs's story from being told. Instead of trying to work as lone scholars, the traditional model of the humanities, we would adopt a team-based approach modeled on scientific fields, such as medicine or astronomy. A total of 16 people, located across 4 countries, contributed to the Ella Briggs project. Our team was composed of architectural historians, architects, curators, archivists, center directors, and university students. Our goal was to collectively research and write a biography rather than produce an edited volume where each contributor worked independently on their own chapter. To do this, we needed a place to deposit our research discoveries where team members would have access to them. And here we come to a key institutional piece of this project, which would not have been possible without the support of the Architekturzentrum Wien. They devoted staff expertise and other resources to help us set up a virtual archival portal that eventually became the Ella Briggs collection. Monica Platzer, the head of collections, was determined that the sources we were in the process of gathering internationally should not be dispersed again once the project was completed. The Briggs collection now contains hundreds of primary documents, all of which have been digitized, as well as physical objects, including a chair that Briggs designed in 1910. Thus, the book project also became the foundation for a new archival collection that will serve scholars for years to come. So I want to conclude by emphasizing that the Briggs biography is proof that even the most challenging histories of migration involving women in architecture can be recovered to a remarkable degree. But these new histories require new methods and new types of institutional support to succeed. Thank you.
Valeria, are you in charge?
Sorry, Monica, of course I am.
Yes, of course you are. Sorry, that sounded really insulting. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. There was just an awkward
Of
pause.
course. So yeah, so I kind of expected the Despina to kind of go straight to Elana, but yeah, she's now in charge of the screen, so she can contribute her presentation, and then Barbara will follow.
Okay, very good.
So thank you very much, Monica, for organizing this event, and Valeria for moderating. It's a pleasure to present a project this evening. So I want to take a second look at what happened in the workshop and what was presented as a kind of introduction, and to try and locate Briggs and how the research expanded our knowledge about Briggs on the book and for the book. And it was how important it was from the beginning to collaborate with Despina and with Monica Platzer and Katrin Stinkel and many other colleagues, Viennese, mostly Viennese, but also from Germany and United States and other countries. What happened for me when I was thinking about this workshop, and we were speaking, Despina and I, about the workshop, is that from few weeks or weeks, I said we have to find new materials, and in order to somehow, there are a lot of people, as Despina said, wrote the masters on Ella Briggs, and it was important to try and see what we could find more. And I had the luck through networks of Holocaust experts to locate the restitution files of Ella Briggs in Berlin. And it was always an amazing surprise how it was important for her to reconstruct her career, not only for the restitution, but also that she saved the original documents, letters of commissions, letters of recommendations, photos that were important that she of interior design that she worked on. So for me, coming back to this original workshop, it's very critical because many of the experts who were also contributed to the book, and I think all of us learned just from the dialogues, from speaking about Ella Briggs and trying to figure out how to locate new information. Now, for one reason or another, I can't push it down. Yeah. So I just want to go back to this, my original presentation, which was an introduction. And it was important for me to find Ella Briggs not as a rand figure in German, you say, as a peripheral person, but as an integral part of the networks of modernism in Central Europe and beyond. And we were reconstructing also the professional and the Jewish networks, but the original focus was on the networks. During this research and working with Sabina Plackung-Forsthuber, who contributed also chapters to this book, it became clear that a critical part of the evolution of Ella Briggs as an architect and as a woman who can define her own fate, which was very rare in the 1920s and 1930s, were the feminist networks in Vienna. And then I want to speak a bit also about what happened during the evolution of her as a career woman, about how she defined herself as an architect beyond borders or crossing borders. She didn't attach herself, even though she was definitely a product of Viennese modernism and feminist circles. She worked herself as an independent architect in different, as Despina said, in the United States and later on in Britain. Then I want to speak about the team that we built together, Despina and I, after the workshop. That was very important. And very, very briefly about what does it mean to work on women in the arts who challenge the canon of modernism. So if you look at my original Facebook-like figures of all the people who influenced her career and how she instrumentalized her networks from Vienna to New York, family networks, her brother Moritz Baumfeld, who was a director of theater, Colin Mosser, who was a teacher at the Kunstgewerbeschule and helped her publicize her first works. Alfonso Mucha, Despina did a brilliant work in her chapter on New York to show the relationship that developed during the work on the theater, the German theater in New York. Her husband, a very problematic guy for many, but also very charismatic, who managed to position himself in modernism also in Vienna, in New York. People like the director of the Austrian Museum of Art and Industry, who gave her recommendation and advice when she needed it, when she was opening in interior design. Sociologist Otto, all these names, architect Martin Wagner, all of them played a critical role. It was a men's network in there that were originally, and later on we developed the Facebook of women. What is important for me to show, and it was important also to show for us, for all of us in the book, is that she was the one who navigated it. She was the one behind addressing Martin Wagner and presenting her work, or addressing Edward Leisching, who was the director of the Museum of Museum of Art and Industry, and asking him for recommendation, or for when she wanted to open a retail shop in New York, and then the ministry asking for money from the Ministry of Austria to finance it. And that's right, the lady makes a very good impression and reveals a great selection in the arts and crafts films. So every person, every clerk in the ministry or colleague made sure to leave an impression that pushed her forward and also formed her own identification. In the first article, major article on the woman as an interior designer in 1914, a man critic called Walder said that she is the person to define a new kind of modernism in an issue that was dedicated to classical modernists like Peche and Joseph Hoffman, important secessionist artists. She was identified as the one who is breaking the code of not a Gesamtkunstwerk, not a Kunstwerk that, not a total artwork that dictates the design, but rather the design that is intended to serve the people and their needs. So, and Martin Wagner, again, in Berlin, when she finishes, like Despina told us, the amazing social housing in 1926, Pestalozzi-Hof, she comes to him with a portfolio, shows him what she wants to, what she achieved until now. And then he writes a letter of recommendation. She takes around with her. Miss Diploma Engineer Briggs, who designed residence in Vienna, presented her work to me. I had several opportunities to discuss structural engineering and architectural design with her. Through this conversation and her portfolio, I gained the impression that her experience as an architect, stemming from her perspective as a woman, could be beneficial for feasible residential construction projects in Berlin. Now, this very strong-head, very, very self-assured woman, in her talents and her, I think, also her rhetoric when she presents her ideas. As Despina said, she came from a Jewish background, and the Jewish background played a critical role here because she came with, her parents came from Galicia, identified as an Eastern European Jews. There was a lot of prejudice also against the Eastern European Jews in Vienna. So she had to work herself in the Viennese setting, even though her family soon gained, as we see from the place she was born in, at the center of Vienna, gained a high position. She had to work against many prejudices against her as a Jewish woman, as an Eastern European Jewish woman, and also as a career woman. Briggs was another. She married him in 1907, I think, Despina, and then he herself. Each person she was in contact with, like Briggs, was integral part of the Viennese modernism. Like Briggs, who she married in New York, actually was one of the early clients of Joseph Hofmann from 1900, interiors that were reproduced in the interior in Vienna. And he also was very powerful after his he actually fled a scandal that he initiated in Vienna. In New York, he also helped again one of her major, this we assume, we don't know, helped her gain her commission to design the Journalist Club in New York. The network, the family network she had, Moritz Bamford, her brother, became a director of theater in New York. So Despina did an amazing research on this interior design. What happened was that she had also family all over Central Europe, including in Breslau, today Wrocław, and the sister of the second wife of her husband, Morris Bamford, Elizabeth Pringsheim, she married a prominent family in Breslau, and they managed to give her commissions in Silesia at the time. What is important is to note is that when we started this research, a very good colleague who researched Briggs for the exhibition in Red Vienna said, she's a very mysterious person. What did she do in Breslau? Was she also, there was a rumor, maybe she was a spying person, maybe she had contacts in Eastern Europe. So the research turned out to be that she actually designed there for friends of the family or so. This is one, it's an assumption, it's not proven, it's not clear what she designed for this family palace this is in the Schutzen, it's in Villa Movici. So this is because I assume it because the production was at Schlesian workshops. This could be the dining bedroom that she designed. But the most important part was of this also for me was what the restitution files offered. And in the restitution files, she somehow reconstruct what happened to her career and how successful was her career in Berlin. And through these restitution files, we found more networks that she developed or who were her clients, like Adolf Bloch, the guy who actually, we didn't know who was the client of Mariendorf in Berlin, a major building, a major construction buildings, a huge that with 54 apartments, etc. That was Adolf Bloch. We didn't find what happened to him because he ended up fleeing Berlin in 1933 in the direction of mandatory Palestine. But this is her managing to give us hints to follow her traces. Another person that was part of this men network was Leo Adler, who was an architectural critic that also supported her. So she managed not only to obtain commissions, but she also managed to position herself as a major architect and designer in the newspapers and magazines at the time. She also has no problem in just addressing people she met in Vienna in the end of 1920s after her forced immigration, like Otto Neurath, and saying, you may recall a visit I made to you in Vienna at the time. I had completed several buildings for the municipality of Vienna, Pestalozzihof, and Students' Home. And do you have a job for me? So she was carrying on her career by herself, even though, and she knew how to operate the networks. And each one of them, as Despina said, also influenced her style. Now we come to the new part. So a second look at the original presentation of these men's networks. Now we come to how forceful and how powerful and the woman-machers of Viennese modernism. And it always starts with the journalists who actually review and push their people into the center of the discussion. Here we have Levitus, who also only mentioned Briggs very briefly in 1912. And we had another major woman rights activist who actually, Daisy Manor, who also then 2 years later gives her a whole section, a whole review about her designs. She uses every institute in Vienna that had to do with feminism or promoting women's empowerment, starting with even giving a lecture at the Athenaeum, which was an association for Studies Association for Women. She gave a lecture in 1912 already on home design, interior design. And here is a whole set of women that actually integrated it, somehow managed to be part of the, I would call, and it would probably be a challenge for it, women's modernism that evolved in the interwar Vienna, including Jela Herzka, who granted her in the New Women's Club for 1914 a base for her exhibition, Gisela Orban, who reviewed her work, many others who played a role. Now, her best friend, like her ex-husband, also was part of Viennese best friends. One of her friends, Melanie Langer, was also part of Viennese modernism as a client. If Briggs, her ex, was a client of Joseph Hoffman, Melanie Langer was a client of Adolf Loos, and she was definitely somehow a token of her ability to integrate, or that she was moving at the center of the making of Viennese modernism. Gisela Orban is the woman who reviewed and pushed forward women architects. And she shaped her own profession as an interior designer first, and then later as an architect. Now, already in the reviews of the war, during the war, 1914-1918, first of all, she's already identified as an architect, not as, although she works as an interior designer, she's identified as an architect. And I think maybe she herself already formed an idea that she wants to become an architect earlier, like immediately after she came back to Vienna, but this is just an assumption. She does go for it, and she does become, as Despina said, and Valeria said before, the first woman to join the Engineers and Architects Association in Austria in 1921, after she finished her degree And these are these two membership cards of her membership cards of the Austrian Association, of the German Association, was sent to the restitution office in Berlin as to prove her credentials as an architect. Now, why is it important for me to note that it's important that it was for her important for her to define herself as an architect crossing borders, because she had to confront with many discrimination, and we can't undermine the discrimination she worked against, you know, stereotypes of Jewish women, and their frivolous relationship, decadent, wealthy. She was so practical and so always searching for the next commission. She was far away. I mean, for her, it was this prejudice. It was just a kind of a, not even an obstacle, something that she would grow out of and make sure to define herself completely different. Then you have, when they first announced the assignment of the Pestalozzi of the social housing, she's identified as a man and not as a woman architect. Yeah, Briggs is identified as a man, and there's 1.5 million shillings invested in it. You've heard about, and maybe also Barbara will tell us about the photographs she took. She became an photograph of architecture. Here we have her brother, who also wrote a book, A Cruising Tour in the Mediterranean. He had a full payment for everything. He published the book. When she goes in the 1920s to photograph Sicily, she is identified as a suspect of spying. She's alone. She's being arrested, and the whole scandal that evolves of a woman architect from Vienna being arrested in Italy. What is important is to know that each one of the reviews referred to her as an architect. It was the woman architect. And if you look at one of the reviews of this, when you're, you know, it wasn't clear if she's an Austrian, because she married a guy who had an American citizenship, because the Austrian guy, he fled to America and took American citizenship. A woman was defined through her husband's citizenship and the passport. It was not clear in many ways who could help her, because many of the people were not in town. And so everybody was slowing, and she was in town. But everybody knew that she was an architect, and she was working on a major commission in Austria on social housing. And as we bring out in the book, newspapers from United States, from all over the world, were reporting about the architect woman who was arrested as a spy. So this was major for her as a kind of a push to an acknowledgement of architecture. When she goes for a citizenship, she wants to take citizenship in Germany, a German citizenship in 1932, and she applies for it against her background, even though now she has distanced herself completely from Jewish background, from the Jewish identification. The rejection keep repeating it. Miss Briggs is not of German descent, which has multiple understandings here. Now, so from the first introduction, focusing on the men networks, to what we gathered, Sabina Forsthuber, and I, and many others, the female network that was so powerful in Vienna came up very strongly. Despina found more names of women in the United States. And so this is something that came up. And very interesting is that we traced her restitution files one by one to locate the assignment, the commission, especially of her as a designer of exhibitions. Now, Despina and I, Despina made the original research in the 1990s, and she also managed to form a lot of the documents she collected as an archive. This was critical push, and also I assume convinced Monika Platzer from the Austrian Architecture Museum to give it a chance for this project, because these documents were critical for launching such a workshop. But many of the people we worked with on this project and who were in the workshop and then worked on the book, all of them are experts, brilliant authors who are dedicated. Like Sabina Plackner-Forster was the pioneer working on women artists and designers in Vienna. Katrin Stingel wrote a brilliant master's on Ella Briggs in 2008. Megan Branderfaller, who writes a chapter, wrote a very good book on the female secession, showing the women's designers and how they emancipated themselves and pushed their own agenda as women in the 1920s. Selina Kress worked on the urban planning in Berlin. Monika Platzer, she would probably kill me for only showing this book. She has many books on Austrian architecture. This is one of those of Central Europe, which was also relevant for us, but she did also the amazing permanent exhibition giving a specific space for women. Ursula Prokop, one of the authors in that book, she wrote their book on Jewish architects in Vienna. Zwingli was she didn't rediscover, but pushed the agenda of rediscovering Margareta Schutter-Lihotzky in Vienna, the second woman of Red Vienna. Eva Tillinger is a curator of the Furniture Museum. She wrote many books on furniture in 1900. And interwar period. She's an expert in the field. Barbara Penna, Despina located. Barbara Penna wrote also, an introduction to modern housing, the text by Catherine Bauer, an American city planner. Sabrina Rahman was the woman who did an amazing exhibition, co-curator on Bilston, the major architecture work of Briggs in England, and Dorte Coleman wrote Jenna. So each one, I'm closing now, each one of them really worked beautifully and wrote fantastic texts for our book. And what is important, and Despina, and I think, this is something that is very important for us, is to show how this collaborative work, and each one bringing her own expertise and knowledge, allowed us in the book itself to challenge many of what we would consider as obviously modern, the flat roof. Ella Briggs already challenged it in a debate in Germany. All sorts of things that she made her own statement. And with the help of this gathering, the initial cooperation between Despina and I and Monika Platzer, which was very important, the trio, turned into a possibility to read the book and learn what it means to challenge the aesthetic categories of modernism and how women's made their brand on this modernistic era or legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elana.
I'm sorry. I'm closing. Yeah.
That's fine. And now the last presentation is Barbara Penna.
Hello. I'm just going to switch to slideshow. This should work. Is that okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So thank you, Elana. At this point in the story, the baton in our collective biography relay was passed to me. And my job was to write Ella Briggs's time in England beginning 1936. And here she is, aged 56. While I was extremely excited to write about Briggs, I quickly realized that I was covering what was the least documented and in some ways the most difficult period of her life. So my first move was to consult Briggs's file at the RIPA. And for Briggs to even have such a file is notable. Although she wasn't the only female architect, female refugee architect in Britain, she was the only one to register, reflecting her unusually high profile. In Britain, in fact, she would often be referred to as the famous lady architect, both by others and by herself. And this assertion of fame and her pursuit of credentials, I think, really speaks to her determination to rebuild her career and also not to sink into obscurity. Yet when Briggs's file arrived at my desk, my heart sank. The file was so thin, a single buff-colored folder containing 2 applications, brief references, and a vague CV. Scholars have really not been able to get much further than this. Briggs appears in Charlotte Benton's A Different World. She's the only woman amongst more than 60 emigre architects. But this entry gives us very little sense of her 40 years in exile. We have filled some gaps through our research. Correspondence at the RIBA between Briggs and Godfrey Samuel, co-founder of the modernist firm Tecton, has shed light on her struggle to secure work and a home office work permit. After an initial rejection, she was granted a permit in 1937, possibly aided by this article, which seemed intended to big her up and boost her profile. Permit secured, Briggs set up her own practice at number 3 Gower Street in Bloomsbury. And I think significantly, her studio was right next door to that of Gertrude Leverkus, the German-born British architect of the Pioneer Housing Association, which built housing for single women. For me, at least, it's tantalizing to realize that 2 of Europe's best-known female housing architects briefly worked side by side at studios in number 3 and number 5. This proximity was probably not coincidence. It was precisely by tapping into such networks that Briggs tried to reroute herself in England. Another important contact for her at the time would be Alistair MacDonald, son of former Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, who would often act as a reference for her. Despite this support, England proved to be a very fragile refuge for Briggs. There was little work and war loomed. Once war was declared in September 1939, Briggs was reclassified as an enemy alien, at which point Sigmund Freud's son, architect Ernst Freud, step forward to provide her with a character reference. Briggs was not interned, although her 70-year-old brother, Fritz, would be. And again, this underscores their very precarious status. And in truth, we don't really know how Briggs got by during the war years. We don't know how she sustained herself. Although Briggs's studio survived the Blitz, you can see her studio underneath this big green arrow on the right. And so it wasn't bombed, but Briggs wouldn't have escaped the effects of the Blitz and the war. Bombs, gas, grit, and piles of uncleared rubble. And perhaps this experience is why, once the war was over, Briggs would retreat from central London to this terraced house in leafy Enfield, where she would remain until the end of her life. And we might have left the story here. Briggs was now 65 years old when many people think about stepping back or slowing down. But post-war reconstruction offered Briggs a second chance, which she desperately wanted. In Britain, reconstruction was not simply about repair, it was about trying to modernize the nation. Refugee architects, with their experience of modern planning, took on key roles in this process. And having built large-scale housing projects in Europe, Briggs was very well placed to contribute. She did this first through writing. She produced more than 30 articles for Homes and Gardens between 1944 and 1954. In contrast to the magazine's typically bright and chatty tone, her pieces were austere, illustrated with these black and white perspective drawings. But she clearly offered English readers something of real value, authoritative advice on how to achieve decent homes in spite of material shortages and rationing. And she promoted such means as expandable houses, prefabrication, and American labor-saving devices. And in 1946, Briggs would be given the chance to put this advice into practice. The commission to design Stowlawn Estate in Bilston in the West Midlands came via philosopher Otto Neurath, a central figure in Red Vienna, and the creator of the isotope system of pictorial statistics. And you can see a slide of isotopes here. Neurath, then in exile in Oxford, had been hired by Bilston Council with the agenda to promote the happiness of local mine workers. Rather amazingly, the council aimed at nothing less than to bring the radical spirit of Red Vienna to one of the most depressed and despoiled parts of England. And the link to Vienna was openly declared when the council hired Briggs describing her, quote, as a Viennese architect of international repute. And they brought her in to realize their vision. Stowlawn Estate itself was laid out by another grandee, British architect Sir Charles Riley. Briggs would build just over 80 dwellings clustered around a so-called Riley Green. That's this oval green in the center. And it was built on reclaimed land, prepared in a terrible irony, really, by German POWs. They supplied the labor for the initial groundworks. Admittedly, it's hard today to see anything visionary about Stowlawn. The houses rather awkwardly blend modernism with the English country style. We have both flat and pitched roofs. We have reinforced concrete details and handmade Stoke-on-Trent tiles there on the roof. More importantly, with political changes, budget pressures, and Neurath's death, Stowlawn's planned communal facilities, a nursery and clubhouse, were abandoned. And these were precisely those amenities that had made Viennese housing so admired and so radical. Nonetheless, I believe we should resist seeing Bilston as just another failed utopia. For Neurath, happiness was never only about style, it was about social mixing. And here, Briggs delivered. Her dwellings accommodated many kinds of occupants. She mixed single-family homes with accessible flats for older people. We see some of those flats here with the balconies. And she was very proud of these flats, emphatically writing in Homes and Gardens, quote, "Single persons and childless couples are valuable members of society, and they deserve something better than having to pay extortionate rents for furnished accommodation, which will never be a real home." And as this quote shows, like Neurath, Briggs took seriously the question of how to improve home lives. At Bilston, she provided tenants with new conveniences, such as indoor bathrooms, modern kitchens, and generous storage. Her interiors are open and unfussy, without separate front parlors, and they were oriented to maximize air and light. In short, Briggs took into account the psychology of dwelling. She was sensitive to qualities like control, privacy, and comfort. Briggs argued, for example, and this is my favorite quote from her, she said, "A kitchen window should face east, lest afternoon heat, quote, destroy the calm of mind desirable for turning out a good meal." And it's just incredibly hard to imagine a modern master like Walter Gropius saying such a thing. Oral histories today confirm how much these qualities were appreciated by residents. And Stow Lawn today remains, as Briggs promised, a community of real homes. And Stow Lawn's commitment to delivering well-being and happiness has attracted new interest today in the media, in exhibitions, and amongst historians. This project would be the pinnacle and the swan song of Briggs's career. It was published in trade journals, and it led to her successful application for an RIBA licentiate. Yet no further major commissions followed, and she retired, living quietly in Enfield for several decades more. And this is the last known photo that we have of Briggs, aged 80. And my closing note, when she died in 1977, aged 97, there would be no obituary for this famous and extraordinary lady architect. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was, again, I mean, all three presentations, I think, really give you a sense of how extraordinary this woman was. I mean, just as an architect, you have been able to do so much, regardless of the fact that, whether it was a man or a woman, it's just unbelievable, across continents, in different countries. She was an artist, she was an interior designer, she was a furniture designer, she was an architect, always at the forefront of the architectural discourse wherever she went. So really an extraordinary life. So it's just fantastic, the fact, the fact that that you put this book together, she really deserves it. And another comment I would quickly wanted to make is thinking about your research methodologies, how I think important really it is, as you demonstrated with this, especially with the stories of migration, to collaborate with people in different countries, especially who can speak different languages, and to research in different ways. I mean, I've had a little experience myself, having worked with Dr. Elana Santos-Camare on the refugee architects project that I've been working on for a few years, because obviously she can access all the archives and the libraries in the Czech Republic, which I obviously couldn't, I could never do. So anyway, it's just your project is really the best demonstration that such an approach in stories like this, stories of migration, is absolutely fundamental and reaps so many rewards and so many benefits. Is there any question from participants? Right, so Jack, says, was she one of the first architects to pioneer such mixed social housing? Does anybody want to answer that question? Or Jackie, do you want to mute yourself and ask it?
Thank you. I seem to have disappeared. I don't know if you can see me. I am here. I can think of some of where I live in Southeast London. We've got a City of London estate, and other estate social housing, old social housing from the 50s, which are quite similar. And I wondered if she was a pioneer of that. Our particular one, which I think is grade 2 listed, in Sydenham Hill, which is quite a famous one, and it's got a mixture of houses and small flats, and there's a nursery there, and there's a green in front, and those and I can think of other housing rather like that, where you've got the social housing, but you've got the mixture. Was she an early? I mean, was she the person who influenced later architects of the 50s, who sort of, where we've got sort of excellent housing, social housing, really, which is, better than now? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yes. In my view, it's a really great question. And one of the things that is quite hard to work out is how connected she was to British housing debates. Because at this time, she would have been in her 60s, and quite removed, I think, from a lot of professional networks. I rather see the spirit of what she was doing as this holdover from the interwar period through her connections with people like Neurath. I would love to say that she was the pioneer, but I doubt that was exactly the case. In her particular case, though, and this comes through reading the Homes and Gardens articles, was she was very preoccupied. She felt that in the post-war period, there was an obsession with building single-family homes. And she really felt that there was this push. I mean, today we might call it a biopolitical push to reassert the nuclear family. And I think her own experience as a single woman living in exile, having this quite precarious existence, I think she almost reacted in an existential way to some of what she saw as this pressure and focus on the nuclear family. And she writes quite frequently about how it excludes so many others. So she frequently would write about older people, childless couples, people who were single. And I think that was her, I think it was at least partially personal for her. I think she really identified with people who stood outside of that norm.
Thank you. Can I just ask another question? Nobody's asked it. It sort of goes against when we think of obviously Barbican estate and those other estates which are now listed, but they're not always the greatest places to live in. And there were the whole sways of flats where, I mean, in South London, of course, the ones again, which are now listed. Sheffield, I know. And they're architecturally, they're supposed to be wonderful, but they're not always the greatest practical place for families. So she wasn't doing that, was she? This was kind of old-fashioned housing.
It was. And it's quite interesting. Of course, I visited this Stow Lawn estate. And as I walked around taking photographs, I got stopped 3 times by people saying, "Who are you? What are you doing?" It wasn't aggressive, but it was just interesting to me. It's a real community. People are very aware of who's there. And it's, very sort of well lived in. It's not in the greatest shape, but I certainly think, and Sabrina, who also contributed to the book, would agree, it's been this very successful estate that's had a long life and has done precisely what Briggs hoped, which is to foster community. And sorry, one last thing to say. I have applied for a blue plaque for Briggs. We're waiting to hear, but I just felt it's really important that she herself get commemorated, maybe not stolen through a listing or whatever, but I feel she deserves some sort of presence in the streetscape as well. So we're waiting to hear.
Yep.
I think we'll agree that she definitely deserves a blue plaque. Any other question from the audience? Well, we have I think just a few more minutes while people think maybe that the last chance for a question. I have one. I was thinking about, another Austrian female immigrant architect, Liane Zimbler, who was quite a bit younger, I suppose, just over, I think, 10 years younger or so, and didn't quite have the same peripatetic life, but she also obviously moved away, and she's built a successful career in the United States. Do you know if they ever cross paths, the two of them?
Well, Liana was this is very interesting because in 1926-7, when Briggs leave Vienna to Berlin, Liana becomes like a shooting star in the feminist circles. She is the architect of exhibitions of the Wiener Frauenkunst, an association that developed in the 1926, and the agenda was to show women's designers and to show the difference between women's designers agenda and Adolf Lozi agenda. And she was the architect. She was promoted she worked closely with the art critics, women art critics and feminists. And she also had major supporters from the Jewish community as well, from the Fossi family, for example, and other major patrons. Around 1936, when she comes back to Vienna, like she's searching 1935, 1936, she's debating what to do because she's scared to stay in Berlin. She fears that she would be arrested or that she would be, and there's even a very direct threat. It's Zimbler who is really the artist among women, the architect that is being acknowledged. And I don't know if through the networks of patrons, if she could have met her, she must have heard about her. If they actually met, I'm not sure, but she must have heard about her because the newspapers and the women critics who were reporting and the Wiener Frauenkunst exhibition really pushed Zimbler to the front stage, and she may have been jealous. 10 years difference and another stronger private network of patrons. But if she actually met her, we need to. I don't think Diana Zimbler mentions Briggs. Yeah, but there's a different, it's very interesting about Ella Briggs. Ella Briggs, she started a career as an architect at the age of 40. Now, Liana Zimbler Schuteliotsky started at 90 in their 20s. Yeah, it's a big difference. She comes as a mature woman with a huge experience in interior designs, and even though and both Schuteliotsky had the whole network of Red Vienna, Adolf Loos in the settlements, other architects in Germany that really supported her building her career in a very concrete way. With Liana Zimbler, she managed to have really powerful families in Vienna. She even made a interior design by Adolf Loos, one of the people who bought a Loos apartment. Briggs, she managed to do a social housing to design. She managed to achieve a lot, but I have a sense that even though she had these networks of modernity, it was her going to the city of Vienna, the city hall, to the clerk saying, "I'm good, choose me." It was really her, pushing it, probably using a recommendation from one of the architects in the Architects Association. It was her moving herself forward from commission to commission, and presenting her portfolio, showing that she's simply good at her work. And
huge,
so
huge determination, huge self-belief and determination. So yeah. Do we have time, Monica, do you think, for one last question?
I think so. Why not?
Alan,
Sure.
Alan, do you want to ask it yourself, unmute yourself, or shall I read it? No? Okay, so Alan asks, apart from the articles in Homes and Garden and her only contact in the Midlands, did she just stop engaging with the world of architecture and in Britain? Did she just live a solitary life in Hendon? Or was it just a case that those did know her, were unaware of her past life? Just seems a large void between 1960 and 1977.
I think that's a fair point. This is something we discussed quite a bit. She seems strangely disconnected from the start from the types of networks that emigre architects typically, certainly modernist emigre architects, typically plugged into. We do know that she socialized with some female, she plugged into some female networks. Betty Kurt, who Elana mentioned, for instance, went to Enfield and had a delightful cup of tea with Briggs one afternoon. So she crops up occasionally. We have glimpses of her, but she doesn't appear in the established professional networks, the Mars Group, for instance. We don't see her where we would perhaps expect to see a well-established, famous architect at the time. And it
was tough for all of them. I mean, for all the emigres, it was certainly tough, and probably because she was a generation, a few generations, in fact, older than a lot of the emigre architects. Not only she was a woman, but she was, she was already, she had a whole career, behind her, and she could have done more, but maybe that didn't help to be, quite a bit older than a lot of the emigres.
Yeah, but yeah.
I mean, it's hard to know if she tried to approach those networks and was excluded, or if she just simply opted out somehow. I think that's where we had quite a few discussions and tried to work that out. I mean, she was a very adept networker. She seemed actually quite good at plugging into British networks like Leverkus, like Alistair MacDonald. But it's hard to know exactly what dynamic was at play there. And then between 60 and 77, she did seem to retreat and live very quietly in Enfield with a companion. So I think at that point she unplugged.
I think, yeah,
There was a
she was quite
Viennese.
in advance.
Yeah,
Sorry, Elana, you go ahead.
no, Valeria, there was a Viennese network in London, yeah, of Jacqueline Grog, Jacques Grog, who also got some assignments. There was Oskar Kokoschka was there. They were seeing Hilda Spiel was there with her husband. There were authors, and there was the Austrian Center. There was the Austrian Cultural Center that also had a theater if someone would want to entertain. There was a whole very developed Austrian emigre, very proud with a newsletter, etc. It would be Barbara did not find many traces of her in these networks. Yeah, it's really, I think what makes Briggs so special is that she, even though she was a product of many modernist networks, or she worked her way through, in the end she went her own way. It was her distinct way of working and designing and making a career. And I think, Barbara, you also found there's a letter that she writes from Vienna to the son of to a very famous Jewish architect who was finding jobs for emigres, and she says, "I'm desperate." Right?
Godfrey Samuel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm desperate to work. I'm desperate to work. She is already late in life, rather, and she wants the jobs. So she didn't give up. Yeah.
I also think we should say that, I mean, we have evidence that she maintained relationships over decades. She was still writing to friends that she had studied with in Vienna, many decades later. And part of the reason that we really wanted to write this book was to make sure that when traces of Briggs show up in other collections, now, whether they're correspondence or something else, people will know who she is and we'll be able to keep tracing these stories.
Definitely.
I think that's a good point, isn't it? Perhaps with which to conclude. And Valeria, you were telling us before we properly started the event that you have managed to track down some photographs of Sicily taken by Ella Briggs,
That's right.
which friends here
That's
had
right.
no knowledge of. So yes, this is very much ongoing, isn't it? And if I could just sort of say a few concluding words. I mean, it strikes me that the methodology you've employed so very successfully is, yes, particularly applicable to women, and indeed to women forced to move. But it is, this kind, I think you called yourself in the book the Ella Briggs Detective Brigade, which I thought was a really charming way of putting it. But of course, it's actually an approach that could be applied to so many other figures who are less well known than they ought to be, particularly when it's a story of movement and exile and forced migration, etc. So I think it's a wonderful sort of a prototype for others to adopt. I think we should probably, Valeria, draw things to a close. I'm looking at the time, and I know we've lost a few people along the way because supper and other commitments beckon. I will just say a few words, if I may. The event, as you may have noticed, has been recorded, and the recording will be uploaded shortly onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. And I should also add there that there are actually quite a few events, some of them involving Valeria, but for example, we did an event some time ago on Walter Segal and Arthur Korn, some interesting figures in the realm of architecture and town planning and many other things besides. So if you're not familiar with the Insiders Outsiders channel, check it out. There's a host of very interesting material, though I say it myself. And if you're interested in knowing more about what Insiders Outsiders gets up to in the future, I would urge you to sign up for the newsletter. If you go to the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website, it's easily done. If you scroll down to the bottom right on the homepage, a matter of minutes to subscribe. And I'd also just like to mention, if I may, there's been a fascinating cluster of events just recently, but with two more still to follow. Next Monday on the 16th of February, we have Juliet Sikrava, who's actually a member of the extraordinary Shapira family. We'll be talking about that remarkable dynastic sort of group of people. And then the following week on Wednesday, the 25th, always at 6 p.m. UK time, we have Anna Nyberg, who's one of my friends and allies in the Insiders Outsiders project, to mark the publication of a brand new book that she has largely written on the history of Thames and Hudson, the art publishing company that continues to flourish to this very day. So perhaps we'll see some of you there. And last but not least, before thanking everybody, of course, I'd like to just mention that Princeton University Press has kindly offered a 30% discount on the already quite modest £35 cover price of this excellent book. And I'll say it now, but I think given that various people signed up and actually obviously couldn't make it tonight, I will actually send a message out as well. But if you go to the Princeton University Press website and you type in the checkout, it's Feb, F-E-B for February, of course, P-U-P for Princeton University Press, 30. You should be able to benefit from that discount. Lovely. And oh yes, just I knew there was one other thing, the matter of blue plaques. I'm very pleased. Barbara, was it you who was saying that you've applied for a blue plaque? I've been in conversation just very recently, just by coincidence in a way, with the Association of Jewish Refugees. And I don't know if you're aware that as well as sort of historic England and all the other ways, the sort of various different societies that put up plaques, they also have initiated already a little while ago a program of blue plaques for appropriate individuals. And I think perhaps if you don't have any success, or we could talk about it further, they might well be interested. So let's keep that conversation going. Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you for saying that. I'll keep that in mind. I'm hopeful.
Good. Let me know. Wonderful. And indeed, if it does happen, then let me know, because we can add it to our newsletter, the news section. Lovely. Well, I think it only remains for me to say a very, very warm thank you, particularly, of course, to the contributors to the book, to Barbara, to Despina, to Elana, and indeed to Valeria for sharing the event. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you at other events. All the very best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks for the participants as well.
Indeed.
Thank you.
All the best.